Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for our John Wilson Jr. panel discussing specifically wrongful conviction. What we'll show you tonight is a pre-recorded webinar that is split up into two parts. It's an hour event.
Gracias a todos por unir con nosotros esta noche. Estamos con el taller de John Wilson, Semana de Libertad. Tenemos una panelista de esta noche que va a compartir con ustedes acerca del tema del encarcelamiento injusto. Vamos a compartir con ustedes con una grabación que ya grabábamos anteriormente.
While we show this pre-recorded webinar, unfortunately that means we're not able to accept your real-time questions, but please not to worry. What we'll do is we'll gather the questions that you have, and tomorrow at another event, we'll be able to address them. This whole week, we've been gathering questions from you, and we look forward to answering them more tomorrow night.
Ver un video grabado anteriormente, es decir, que no podemos contestar sus preguntas hoy, más estamos compilando todas las preguntas de ustedes y esta semana también, cada noche estamos compilando las preguntas y después podemos contestarles en el futuro.
So I want to thank you all for the patience that you're having with us tonight. We want to make sure that all of our technology is worked out and our accessibility is 100%. We will show a video. We will show the first part and the second part. And in between the first and second part, we'll have a brief intermission. Please take the time to have a drink of water, grab a bite to eat while you're in your thoughts.
Gracias a todos. Esta noche vamos a mostrarles un video de dos partes, parte 1 y después parte 2. En el intervalo les animamos a tomar un descanso, tomar agua, reflexionar en lo que estamos compartiendo con ustedes esta noche.
So lastly, I would like to discuss about our event that's happening tomorrow, which is the end of our week commemorating John Wilson Jr. We'll be discussing mass incarceration as a panel tomorrow night at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. We'd love it if you could join us, and you could use the hashtag John Wilson Lives. Also, the hashtag Deaf Wrongful Conviction.
Y gracias por su paciencia. Esta noche estamos enfocando en proveer un taller accesible a todos y queremos solucionar cualquier problema de tecnología. So, gracias por su paciencia. Esta noche vamos a compartir con ustedes y mañana será el último día de esta semana de libertad de John Wilson. Entonces, les animamos a compartir en sus redes sociales con hashtag John Wilson Lives. Y mañana las panelistas van a tratar del tema del encarcelamiento injusto y después se puede usar también hashtag Deaf Wrongful Conviction, es decir, encarcelamiento injusto de los sordos.
This is Esperanza signing. I should have mentioned this. Now, if you do need a Spanish interpreter or an audio of a Spanish interpreter, please do look at the box at the bottom. There's an audio link to the Spanish interpreter. Thank you.
Y quiero mencionar, si ustedes quieren acceder a este seminario web con interpretación a español, hay un globo en la parte abajo de su pantalla. Se puede hacer clic y después le va a permitir escuchar este seminario web en español. Gracias.
This is Esperanza signing. Thank you so much. I think we're ready to begin the event. I want to ask our HERD tech support. Are we ready? Thank you so much. Hello, good evening, everyone. We are here for a great event. We have TL, me, and Debbie. We'll all be discussing John Wilson Jr.'s case and what led to his wrongful conviction. TL has worked hard over many years on this case. And what we want to do is take a deep dive into the legal system and its impact on John Wilson Jr. and his wrongful conviction. Not only that, but also in the deaf disabled community. For accessibility purposes, I will describe what is on the screen at the moment. There are 3 folks here in our Zoom webinar. Fortunately, we're not able to see you as an audience because this is pre-recorded. And unfortunately, you cannot pop up on screen with us. It's just watching and listening only. If you'd like to hear English or Spanish interpreting, you can certainly turn that on with the button at the bottom. If you need a Spanish interpreter, the same button applies. You can just click the language Spanish. If you need closed captioning, you'll find a button at the bottom that's labeled CC. Please click that and turn it on, and you'll be able to view closed captioning. Now, I'm sure many of you will have questions. If you do have questions, please click on the Q&A and type the questions. It's possible after this we'll be able to answer the questions that you have. Also, feel free to use the chat box to participate. Put your thoughts, your questions in the chat box for everybody to see. For accessibility purposes, I'll now describe what's on your screen. There's 3 of us here in a Zoom webinar. I am in one box. I am light-skinned white. I have soft brown hair. I have a purple shirt that has sleeves down to my wrists. I have a blank wall behind me with a little bit of art that is to my right. Now, the next box contains Debbie. Debbie is white. Debbie is wearing a gray beanie hat. Debbie also has a black shirt on with 2 white stripes over their arms. Debbie is sitting. Now the third box contains TL. TL is sitting. TL is black. TL is wearing glasses and a hat. TL is wearing an overcoat with a white shirt underneath it. Behind TL sits a couch and bookshelves with plants. As a reminder to you all, we do have real-time interpreting at the moment. We would love to be 100% accurate, but it may not happen, but please do not worry. We want to work together to make sure everybody has 100% accessibility. We will try our best to keep it at a regular pace and not too quickly so everybody understands. Now I'd like to share a content warning before we proceed. Tonight's discussion may be heavy. It may bring up trauma. It may bring up emotions in folks. We're going to be discussing wrongful conviction and the impact that the incarceration of folks, how that impacts the deaf and disabled community. If you need a break, please feel free to step away. Please type it in the chat box if you'd like a break. Take care of yourself. TL?
This is TL. Thank you so much for that, Esperanza. I just want to remind folks that we will be discussing death and murder today also, because John Wilson was accused of murdering someone. So I just want to remind people who might have triggers related to that. It's important that they're aware of that in advance too.
This is Esperanza signing. Yes, thank you so much, TL, for that. That's absolutely important. Keep in mind, we'll be discussing heavy topics like death. So please respect your heart, mind, and body and take care of whatever needs you have. Now I'd like to discuss different terminology that we'll be using for tonight's event, making sure that we all understand it and we're all on the same page. Now we'll be discussing a man named John Wilson Jr. and his sign name is JW on the shoulder. Wrongful conviction is also something we'll be discussing, and this is the sign we used for it. Or you can sign this sign. Another term we'll be talking about is mass incarceration. This is the sign we use. The next concept is prosecutor. This is the sign we use. TL?
Hey, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Esperanza. Do you mind showing the sign that hearing people usually use for prosecutor that's really confusing so people can connect what you just said?
Sure, this is Esperanza signing. I'd be happy to elaborate on that. I'd say an antiquated sign that was made up by the hearing community for the word prosecutor is generally signed like this, which is basically an accuser or a suer. And then folks realized that actually prosecutors can incarcerate people. That was the big misunderstanding. It was very confusing. When in reality, we have the civil system and we have the criminal system. There's two different roles for prosecutors in each one. There's a lawyer in the civil suit, and then there's a prosecutor in the criminal justice system. They play different roles. Now, for civil cases, generally it's about a person suing another person, maybe due to a civil rights violation, and they'd like some monetary damages. Now, in criminal cases, nobody's looking for monetary damages. How do I explain this? Yeah, you see, there's nothing about violation of civil rights. A prosecutor, most folks, if they think they're going to sue, they don't realize that it can actually lead to incarceration. Folks can maybe be confused and think that they are going to be owing money. But it's important to make sure that people know that prosecutors in the criminal world, you're right, criminal world, there's penalize. They will penalize and punish folks. That's the point. So I want to make sure that we're clear on that and there's no understanding, because there's a clear understanding, because this really impacts a lot of people and it's dangerous. So you can also fingerspell the word prosecutor or sign this. Thank you, TL. I hope everybody understood that. I hope that was clear. Another word that we're going to use is exoneration / exoneree. This is a person who was found innocent and released from prison. Another term we'll be using is Innocence Project. This is the sign for Innocence Project. Now, TL and Debbie, do you have other signs that you'd like to share with our audience before we proceed, or do you feel like that's good enough?
Thank you. This is Debbie signing. Thanks. I think we have to remind ourselves that some signs will change over time. This is not a situation where the signs are fixed. As the community gains more experiences and understanding, signs will change, and we need to honor that. Thank you.
This is TL. My last thing. Esperanza, do you mind expanding on Innocence Project? What's that?
This is Esperanza signing. Yes, the Innocence Project is a hearing organization that is in all 50 states that represents incarcerated people who claim they are innocent. They work hard in order to free the folks that are actually innocent. They gather facts, things like that.
TL signing, and thanks. I just want to let everybody know that our Heard Home sign is actually IP, Innocence Project. That's our Heard Home sign.
This is Esperanza. That sounds great. So from here on out, I'll sign IP. Wonderful. So I am so excited that we'll begin this event. If you're ready, I'd love to talk about wrongful conviction and the impact on the deaf community. I'm ready too. Now, before we start into the deep dive of the discussion, I wanted to talk about what we've noticed through years and years of looking at disabled cases. There seems to be a top 7 reasons why cases will lead to wrongful conviction. I'm going to discuss them. The first thing that you'll notice is eyewitness testimony. Generally, it's unreliable. It's not always there's a misunderstanding. It's not always the right person that they're fingering. The second one is prosecutorial misconduct. They may not follow the right procedures or the laws, etc. The third reason that could lead to a wrongful conviction is the use of old or outdated science. Another thing that could lead to wrongful conviction is coercing or forcing a confession. That happens pretty often, we've noticed. Another thing that police and law enforcement like to do is to get in touch with incarcerated folks to gather information on the person they're trying to convict in exchange for a more lenient sentence. Now, with the information that the incarcerated person gives, they use it against the person they're trying to convict. And also a thing we've noticed is the person may be innocent, but they'll engage in the negotiations and go for a plea agreement, thinking that's the right thing to do. That happens so often, it's very common. Finally, the seventh reason that generally leads to wrongful conviction is when a person is going to trial, the lawyer that they're given they may not have enough resources, they may be underfunded, and not actually equipped to defend the person to their fullest extent, even though they're innocent.
This is Debbie signing, and everything that you discussed is very valid. The information is accurate and correct. I also want to let you know that there is more in-depth information in ASL at HERD's website and available to our community. It talks about more information about wrongful conviction and incarceration. There's infographics and about 2 hours worth of information that is all in ASL. That was distributed by HERD last December. As recently as last month, members of the Black and Indigenous communities came together and had a conversation that was filmed regarding wrongful conviction and incarceration. And I really would encourage you not only to watch that yourselves, but to share that among the community. I know I learned a great deal and it was tremendously beneficial. Oh, hold, yeah. Oh, no, I'm sorry, go ahead.
This is Esperanza signing. I wanted to make sure that I talk about the video that Debbie is mentioning. Sometimes they're hard to find on our website because we have so many videos with different topics. What I would suggest is searching the hashtag deaf wrongful conviction. That hashtag will lead you to a slew of videos on this topic about deaf and disabled folks experiencing wrongful conviction. Just as an FYI. Debbie, you were saying something?
Oh, no, I'm fine. That was exactly what I was going to talk about, was the hashtag. Thank you.
This is Esperanza. TL, do you want to add something?
Nope, that was perfect. You all got it great.
This is Esperanza. Great. Now I'd really like to take a deep dive and focus on the wrongful conviction of John Wilson Jr. and how that's impacted his case, if you're ready to do that. Now we know that the legal system has done many wrongdoings. There's a lot of issues. We would think that they want to own up to their mistakes and fix them, but it's actually the opposite. What we've noticed is most of the time law enforcement and the legal system, what they want to do is just make the cases go through. And this is an impact everywhere. What the legal system prioritizes is the running and completion of cases. I do not think that they're focused on fairness and just process. Now, wrongful conviction is very common here in the United States in the criminal system. I'd say 1 to 7% or more of our 2.3 million incarcerated individuals are actually innocent. Can you imagine that? So it's important that we keep this conversation alive and make sure we understand how these things are happening in order to actually make a change. I'll explain some reasons as to why wrongful conviction is so common. I wanted to ask, TL, could you please explain other impacts that have led to wrongful conviction in the deaf and disabled community that maybe the hearing community doesn't notice? TL?
This is TL. Yeah, I can do that. But first, I want to just make sure one thing is clear. You mentioned that 1 to 7% statistic a moment ago of wrongful conviction. of the 2.3 million people we have incarcerated here in the United States. It's 1 to 7% of that 2.3 million. I just want to make sure everyone is clear. Not all of those people, but it's at least 1 to 7%, to be clear. It could very well be higher. No one knows, and that is also part of the problem. So I just wanted to clarify that and make sure everyone's clear and that we're clear with our statistics. So you asked me about other possible reasons that lead to wrongful conviction of deaf, disabled people. To be honest, our entire society is ableist, practices ableism. So that's a really huge issue. And that pops up, of course, in the entire United States society, not only in the legal system, but where people just don't focus on ableism. And what does ableism include? Autism. It includes sanism, which means discrimination against people who their minds function differently. Maybe they've been labeled having intellectual disabilities, labeled having mental illnesses, and many other labels. So that's what sanism means. Vidism is another form of ableism. It's discrimination against people who are low vision or blind. People who struggle with English generally. So linguicism is another issue. There really is strong oppression against people who don't use English as a first language or at all in the legal system. And just to remind everyone that ableism is an umbrella term that encompasses a number of different kinds of ableism. For example, a Black deafblind person experiences intersected oppressions. And to be frank, the stories from Black deafblind people about their experiences in the US criminal legal system are absolutely horrific. Another commonly overlooked factor is the Innocence Projects, who you just explained, these organizations that support innocent folks to be freed from incarceration. Sometimes they completely overlook ableism, and these lawyers are trying their best, doing great work, and I don't want to devalue their work. But they do often miss that ableism, racism, and classism have to be central to all of the work that they're doing at all times. So I think that's my summary.
This is Debbie signing, and I did want to ask a follow-up question. If you look at John Wilson's case specifically, and then considering all of the isms that you just explained to all of us, can you comment on which of the isms you think might have had the most impact on his case?
This is TL signing, and I really appreciate that question because Esperanza just mentioned the top 7 reasons for wrongful conviction. Obviously, top 7 means there's many, many others. And we collected that information from research on wrongful convictions. And understand that information doesn't include deaf and disabled people. That's the overlooked population, obviously. But I have 6 top reasons for John Wilson's wrongful conviction. I think it's 6. Let me count. Yes, 6 that I'll offer up for today. And first, what I'll do is mention them for right now, and then maybe later we can expand on them. Maybe you all have questions for me, and maybe we'll pick one and expand on. I'm not sure. Anyways, autism and ableism because he's deaf and had other disabilities as well. Racism was critical in his case. Classism was also evident in his case. Police and prosecutor misbehavior. They were engaged in a number of improprieties. Another relevant factor in John's case was police informants. Another important factor was that he had a defense attorney who was either underinvested in or wasn't qualified or didn't do a good job. I can explain a little bit more later and we'll provide some examples so you can clearly see what I mean when I say not qualified or uninvested in. Understand, sometimes defense attorneys are overwhelmed. They have too many cases because mass incarceration has led to defense attorneys being completely overwhelmed in terms of their caseload. And obviously with disabled and deaf folks included, more time is required to be invested in those cases versus a non-disabled hearing case that you might have. but now they don't have any time available because their time is completely eaten up with all of these cases that they have. Often another issue is that defense attorneys don't have the same resources as prosecutors. In fact, prosecutors resources far outweigh defense attorneys. So those are some things to remember, and we're not labeling all defense attorneys bad. We're remembering that these are systemic and structural issues that we have to address in the criminal legal system in the U.S.
This is Debbie signing, and I want to thank you for pointing all of that out. And it's clear that is significant, and there's probably pieces we've even overlooked. Now, you mentioned about both the police and the prosecutors, and that they often interact in ways that cause disruption and significant misuse in the system. And I want to talk about John Wilson's case specifically in that light. In that case, we have actual documents that show what the interrogation between the police officer and John Wilson looked like. We have those documents. I want to show that to the audience so that they can see and get an idea of what that interaction was like. As you look at that, you will clearly see that there was not clear or appropriate communication. There were significant misunderstandings. There were people that were trying to write back and forth, the officer and John Wilson. That's not ideal. Of course, there was fingerspelling that was poor, and there was no interpreter provided. I really want to make sure that the audience sees that so that we all have the same and complete understanding.
This is TL. In our tech support, we have 3 or 4 documents, but before we show them, I just wanted to mention and prep them up. But we'll have our videos off when those documents are shown, just to let you know in advance. And the first 3 I want to let the audience know are what's called Miranda cards. It's a little card called Miranda. Okay, and then the second 2, they're side by side papers. You'll see it when it comes up. It's John Wilson writing back and forth. Debbie mentioned this, him writing back and forth with the police. But for now, let's turn our videos off and we'll let those come up. This is TL signing. I see both of you shaking your head. You're kind of surprised and dismayed by what you've seen in these documents. And this case was from the 90s, but I want to really emphasize that precisely the same thing is still happening every day in the United States, where disabled people, including deaf people, or people who struggle with the English language, are consistently coming up against a system that is oppressive and intentionally doesn't accommodate their needs. This is still going on today, and that's because this is cyclical, because systems occur in cycles, and so it doesn't stop simply because we want it to stop. We as a community have to really intervene to stop it. So I want to back up a little bit, TL signing again still. I want to back up a little bit. You all just saw those 3 Miranda cards. And you saw the side-by-side interrogation paper where they wrote back and forth with John Wilson. I know it was a short time. You all in the audience can watch that later and look at it longer. You can pause it and look at it for details, find details. For time purposes, we just showed it briefly here. But on the first Miranda card, I want to emphasize that John, he clearly didn't even know what he was supposed to be writing. On one line, he wrote, "Be the true." That's his language, be the true. And in his mind, he meant, I'm telling you the truth, I'm being honest. But police begin to become suspicious when people say, I'm being honest with you, I'm being honest with you. Although in his language, and many deaf people tend to say, oh, honestly, I'm just gonna tell you my comment now, but always say to be honest or to be true. But police actually find you to be suspicious when you do that and think you're lying. So that's a conflict of cultures. On the second Miranda card, it's clear he didn't understand anything. It's clear that somebody said, go ahead and just sign right there, because he crossed out his name in a couple of places and wrote yes in another place. It's clear he was confused. I don't even need to have been there. He didn't understand what he was even supposed to be doing. So even with the card, if he was that confused with the card, obviously during the interrogation where they're trying to write back and forth with him about even more complicated things, he didn't understand what was happening. And again, he wrote be the true on that interrogation document. And then he wrote, I didn't kill her at all. So again, when we talk about cross-cultural miscommunications, the police begin to expect, what do you mean at all? Does that mean in English? In the English language, you just say, I didn't kill the person. That's enough to say it in English. So he was trying to accommodate them and convince them, I'm not involved in this thing. I had nothing to do with that at all. So in sign language, that's an emphasis, not at all. But in English, what it literally means is maybe I killed her a little bit. So it has the opposite meaning than the intended meaning in the different languages. So that's another cross-cultural miscommunication. But I just want people to understand that from the start, there was no understanding being had. These were cross-cultural miscommunications. What are you all's thoughts and expansions on what you noticed?
This is Esperanza signing. Yeah, I'm as a deaf person, a deaf and disabled person, in society, we're taught that we should be honest with the police. We should talk to them, that it's okay. We work with them, we respect them because they're figures of respect. But often, in wanting to share exactly what happened, wanting to let them know, like, no, we're innocent, etc., we realize that cops we shouldn't be trusting cops. John Wilson's primary language was sign language. He wasn't comfortable writing. So like you said, TL, he had to accommodate the police. And from here on out, I think I shouldn't write to cops at all. And that's what it's teaching me. It's scary.
TL signing, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but I'm excited about that point. That's the emphasized point. People think, oh, let me chat with the police. We should not be chatting with the police, writing back and forth with the police. Police are very sneaky and smart. The Miranda card, let me show you the size of it. It's like that big. It looks like nothing. It's very cutesy. It feels like it's not important. People shrug and say, hey, I can sign that, no big deal. But it's a huge deal. It's really hugely important. I can't emphasize it enough, how important it is. So people who struggle with English think, oh, it looks like a little wallet card. I'll just go ahead and sign it. But it really protects all of your rights. And you've literally just given them out the window because you signed the paper and you didn't fully understand your rights. And so the point is, none of us are smart enough to just be able to try to figure out how to navigate this system. And yes, disabled people are taught, go ahead and trust police. And it is really the opposite. So many times, I've been doing this for 15 years, studying these cases, and it's the same story every single time, and it's happening today. So that's right, we don't need to talk to the police, and I know later we'll talk about that more deeply, that concept. Debbie, did you have something to say?
This is Debbie signing, and I need you to know this is not sitting well with me. I'm really struggling with this, and I'm bothered. TL, you explained it very clearly, and you talked about that document, that card, really being not much of anything at all. It looked like something we should just sign and move forward. Even with all the scribbling on it, it makes it feel like it sends the message that it's not at all important. And it's almost like a trick in the sense that it is really important. You really should not be touching the document. That's the message I'm getting. Don't put pen to paper at all. And that is really the piece on this. And I feel like that takes full advantage of someone like John Wilson, and it is infuriating. You know, I look at, even with my own deaf family, a lot of the time we'll write something or sign something and we'll think, well, if it's a mistake, we can fix it later. When the interpreter gets here, we'll explain it. And in this case, that is not at all the situation. You're really on your own. If you didn't understand the finger spelling, too bad, you're stuck. You signed it. And again, that's disheartening. That becomes truly to me a wrongful conviction and a wrongful incarceration. I am so struggling with this. I don't even know. Wow.
This is Esperanza signing. Oh, yes, our feelings, our thoughts, what's going on for us right now. It just feels icky. You're absolutely right. I wanted to ask TL, can you share one or two examples in which there was some cross-cultural miscommunication?
This is TL signing. I have so many different examples, it's hard to even know where to begin. Obviously, fingerspelling police officers are a huge issue. Right now, we have someone in DC, many people in DC, police officers and other cities, police who themselves, some can sign pretty fluently, some are codas, some are certified interpreters, some can fingerspell and kind of can get some things right here and there. John Wilson encountered a fingerspelling police officer. And understand, his charges were very serious. And he needed full access, and instead he was busy trying to accommodate cops. And that led to all of these cross-cultural miscommunications. That's just one example that I'll share right now.
This is Esperanza signing. And just to add, John told the police that he didn't understand the fingerspelling. He told the cops that the communication was not effective, but the cops did not care. They just went ahead, tried to gather as much information, again, without the full accessibility that should have been there.
This is TL signing, and I think we do have a transcript from another deaf person, not John Wilson himself. There was another deaf person who was considered a witness, a government witness in this case. And during their testimony in court, they required a team of deaf interpreters and hearing interpreters. They had complex language access needs. And during interrogation with the police, the same fingerspelling officer was there. And the transcript we're going to show you in a moment. Gosh, my brain, I have so many things I want to share at the same time. It's hard. I'm trying. But maybe the three of us right now can just turn off our cameras and tech support can bring that up. And then we can expand on it after. I'll explain more later. This is TL signing. Did the two of you want to briefly touch on that before we see the next pages, or?
This is Debbie signing. So I noticed there is an interpreter present with regard to my read of the transcript. And John Wilson had an interpreter there. Can you explain when and where that happened?
TL signing here. That was during formal testimony at court during John Wilson's trial, not John Wilson himself. It was another deaf person who the defense lawyer was questioning them. So that's that transcript. And the defense lawyer is asking this other deaf person, well, why'd you sign the paper if you didn't understand the fingerspelling cop? If you didn't understand it, why'd you sign the paper? So there's a few more pages. Maybe we show those all 3 pages, and then we discuss after we show all 3 at the same time. So we have all 4 at that point. So let's put our cameras down. We'll let the tech support show all 3, and then we'll come back.
This is Debbie signing. So the documents that you just showed us, that whole series of documents we just looked at, reflect the prosecutor's questioning of one of the witnesses in court, and John Wilson as well, or just the witness? Just the witness. So all of those documents reflect the witness's questioning. For people who are not familiar perhaps with case documents or transcripts, it might be hard to follow, and I want to make sure we're clear, and I know many of the legal folks in the audience already understand them. My point is that the witness had a certified deaf interpreter with them in court, correct? And through that interpreter, the witness explained that even though I didn't understand exactly what I was signing, I went ahead and signed it. And the prosecutor seems essentially to completely disregard the fact that the person didn't understand what they were signing. They didn't ask any further questions about that. They simply pushed that aside and focused solely on the fact that the person had signed the document, correct?
This is TL. I understand now a little bit more about why there's some confusion. So I have to mention that these most recent visuals are completely separate than the Miranda cards that we showed earlier. And this actually fits perfectly within your question that you just asked me about the cross-cultural miscommunications and how those led to misunderstandings. So in this case, the deaf person was a non-speaking deaf person. Remember, John Wilson has speaking privilege. He could speak some. And when he heard from information in the community that this non-speaking deaf person would have to go to the police precinct to answer questions about this death, he said, well, let me come help you because I can speak and you can't. So let me help you. I'll show up with you to the police precinct to provide support because he knew the police weren't providing interpreters. And it's like Esperanza mentioned earlier. A part of deaf culture is deaf people support other deaf people. The problem then is that the police start to become suspicious. Well, we wonder why this guy keeps showing up. Why does he need to come and accompany this person? And of course, John Wilson was trying to accommodate the deaf person because he knew the police wouldn't, because he had already experienced interrogation without interpreters. And because John Wilson could speak, he thought he would intervene. And of course, you all remembered Ricky Haywood, his best friend, yesterday said many times, oh, John Wilson is always so kind and always would interpret for me, right? John Wilson kind of served as an interpreter, although he wasn't, for a lot of deaf people who couldn't speak. So the paper you saw is actually from 2 years later in court during testimony of that deaf witness, who during the interrogation John Wilson showed up with to support, but the police pushed him out of the room. And instead they went ahead and interrogated this person without the benefit of any accommodations, despite the fact that 2 years later this person required a deaf interpreter during court proceedings.
This is Debbie signing. So you mean the deaf individual that was a witness went to the police and John Wilson came with the person because he really wanted to help with communication. Behind the scenes, he really should not have been doing that, but he has a very helpful nature and wanted to do that. The police basically dismissed John Wilson's support, went ahead and questioned the individual, the deaf individual, with no interpreter, only the officer that could fingerspell. Now, when you look at the court transcript, it's very clear that they did have a certified deaf interpreter at court to make sure that communication was clear there, but they did not have that with the police. There was really nothing there, well, except for this fingerspelling, but obviously still that was insufficient. Okay, now I understand.
Esperanza signing. Just to clarify, so that DC police officer who was fingerspelling, this has happened quite often in these cases. Most cops in the district thought that this person was being so helpful. This police officer can sign, they can fingerspell, therefore can be sort of a makeshift interpreter. So when they'd interrogate people, the information would get lost. So they would bring in, they thought a neutral party to help with communication, but in their mind, they're thinking, okay, let's use a cop as an interpreter, but she's not even a qualified interpreter. They're fingerspelling. So it's just ridiculous to me.
This is TL. I just have to take this moment to emphasize that even if the best interpreters in the entire world show up for your interrogation, you do not talk to the police. And yes, I understand that that is hard, But remember that deaf people have the right not to communicate with the police, and you have to assert that right or you lose it. So let's say 3 interpreters show up and they're the best interpreters in the world. Are you just going to go ahead and speak to the police? Absolutely not. You never talk to the police. Any and everything you say to the police will be used against you later. So do not talk to the police. And yes, it's hard for deaf, hearing, non-disabled, abled, because you're anxious, you want to help, but be quiet, demand a lawyer, that's all.
This is Debbie here signing. At the hashtag deaf wrongful conviction, I saw your tweet sharing information about the Reid technique. That technique is a kind of interrogation strategy used by our police. Our police are trained all over the US in this Reid technique. And in your tweet, you mentioned that the Reid technique, the use of that, when coupled with an individual who has a disability, it becomes essentially a recipe for disaster in terms of wrongful conviction and incarceration. So I was not as certain about that technique, so I did some searching and some information gathering. I read your chapter regarding the technique, and in that you explain that the technique itself, the way that it teaches people to interrogate and question, that strategy and technique is banned in other countries all over the world. But in the US, that technique is used extensively. It makes me wonder if that's why we have such a high incarceration rate here in the United States. That technique, as I understand it, basically is coercive and forces often wrongful convictions and confessions. That Reid technique seems to me, as I learn more about it, rather dangerous. Can you please explain more about the technique and then how a person with a disability ends up so negatively impacted by that technique and the strategy?
This is TL signing. Yes, I can, but I think there was one more thing that we wanted to show the audience to help really finalize and summarize that last point, and that we wanted to really emphasize this. Did anyone see the name of the police officer on that transcript? Did you recognize the name on the transcript?
This is Esperanza signing. I did see the name Myra. I'm not too familiar with the person's last name, but I know that she's very well known in the community as a person who knows fingerspelling. But that is a threat to the deaf community. That's dangerous. So could you tell me what their full name is? I don't know it by heart, sorry.
Right. Esperanza, you used to go to Gallaudet University, right? Yes. So that officer used to be on campus all the time, and everyone's like, oh, hey, 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 hey. Now the person can sign pretty well.
Okay.
Right.
A little bit.
Okay.
I mean, definitely not fluent, but.
Right. But the point is that, people seem to be so thrilled about having these signing police officers, including this one. But this person who could fingerspell was being used to facilitate communication between disabled and deaf people. And then this person was promoted to the head of the Deaf and Hard of Hearing Liaison Unit. Then she retired, now she's back. And the point isn't to target that person, because Debbie and I have been dealing with this up in New York as well, where they've got fingerspelling cops and everyone's like, oh yay, let's invite them to all of our events and have them teach us things. And the problem is our communities continue to miss the systemic nature of the violence that is at the heart of policing systems. We don't want more ways to communicate with police. We want less interactions with police, period. And so for over 30 years, this person has been being used to facilitate communication
during these investigations, and we don't want that kind of thing to continue to happen. Notably, this officer's competency and fluency is not called into question. And I want people to really just sit with that. When you are a deaf person and you're dealing with signing cops, no one actually really gets your side of the story. You don't have a witness there. You can't then go back and say, oh, that person misunderstood what I said. That officer forgot to tell this part of my story. And Debbie, I know we don't have a lot of time, but you've been digging deep into this up in New York. Did you want to say a few words on it?
This is Debbie signing. And I do notice some patterns and similarities. What I will say is that in DC, within a certain area, there is a police force and other legal individuals who are very often trained or know some sign language. And Gallaudet University often calls upon police from that area to respond. And we know that that is risky. Now, when I look at NTID, which is a college in Rochester, New York, Rochester has on their police force a deaf and hard of hearing liaison. This is often an individual that is eager to be promoted within the force, eager to be right in the middle of attention in our community, and really, honestly, it's a problem. What I often see is that the individual is harmful because they think that they can easily provide access on their own without using proper interpreting services. That officer often gets called more often to interrogations and other matters, and that is frightening. They may be very sweet, they may be very friendly and easy to talk with, but the bottom line is none of that qualifies them to be conducting themselves in these types of legal interactions. They may be very nice, but it's a boundary that must be drawn. When it comes to matters of the law, if something legal is happening, I need to have clear communication. I need to know exactly what things will look like and how things are affecting me. That's me just thinking out loud here.
This is Esperanza signing. I do really want to emphasize the point that you made, that no one should speak to, in any capacity, to the police. It doesn't matter where you are, school, university, that type of cop, they're still a cop. They still report to the station. They still are they still have the same level of authority. A lot of campus cops may seem like they're less threatening. They're like friendly with the kids on campus, but honestly, they could do the same thing. They could accuse you of something. They are just as much a cop as anybody else in uniform. So you should not talk to cops at all. Thank you for that explanation.
So now, this is TL, so now I think I can maybe touch on the Reid technique, and we'll just have to really summarize. Debbie did do a great job of explaining before we kind of went off to discuss signing cops or cops who can do some level of sign language. It's a guilt presumptive, the Reid technique is a guilt presumptive interview and interrogation process used by police officers in the United States. They say that they can look at a person's body language, listen to a person's tone of voice, evaluate the speed of response, and there's a whole host of other things that they've created, these theories. And they say that they can use that information to determine someone's deceit or honesty. Those who provide training on this technique have become incredibly wealthy, despite the fact that other countries have banned this technique because it's known to lead to coerced confessions and wrongful convictions. So these theories of theirs about body language and behavior and posture, again, they say that they can determine who is being honest or deceitful simply based on that, but clearly people with disabilities behave differently. Their norms are differently. They're not going to match up to the quote-unquote expected norm. And maybe hearing people from other countries, migrants, for example, might not look someone in the eye, for example, out of respect for authority. That might be a cultural norm. You can't presume guilt because of that, but that's precisely what is done. Maybe an autistic person doesn't make eye contact. That's another one of the things that attaches presumptions around deceit. And one thing that really had me deeply upset is that during the Reid training, they said, so you all know what deaf nod is, but the training says that if the police officer asks the suspect the question and the person says no but nods their head in the affirmative, you're supposed to believe their body language, prioritize their body language over the response that they've just given. And obviously that's in complete conflict and contradiction with everything we know and everything we do. But I'll ask folks to turn off their videos now. This is TL. I see both of you just shaking your head in disbelief. Well, believe it. And remember that people who are marginalized tend to experience extreme anxiety with law enforcement because of the histories of violence they've experienced. So that behavior, which is normal for them, and we should just be honoring that behavior because of the environmental factors, actually, because of these techniques, is attached to presumptions around honesty and deceit. And remember, these norms are created by white, cis, wealth-privileged men who tend to be quite comfortable interacting with police, whereas Black, Indigenous, Latinx, deaf, disabled people, it's quite the opposite. And so they're placed in this position of disadvantage simply because these norms are created by people in positions of power. These kinds of theories harm all marginalized communities, and no marginalized person especially, but really no one should go into police interviews thinking that they can navigate it. You cannot win talking to the police.
Yes. This is Debbie. So the Reid technique is designed by white, mainstream America. It's strongly supported by the same people, and those people take full advantage of what is being taught and developed. They don't even consider individuals with disabilities. Mainstream white Americans are the ones who will be taking all of that information. They will use it to their benefit. And quite honestly, I wonder if that's what's causing our mass incarceration. It really is horrible. It's disgusting.
TL saying, I really want to respect time, so I think we do have to move on, but I know I'm on the hot seat right now, so I know y'all have more questions for me, but maybe one day we can host a full panel on Reid technique and disability. I know many people might want to dive in deeper on that, but let's hold it and maybe pin it for later.
This is Esperanza signing. I did want to talk just briefly about the Reid technique, because honestly, that makes me nervous. You know, I didn't realize that it's important to acknowledge that Black and brown people, deaf, disabled people are being targeted. It scares me to hear about that technique. So thank you so much for sharing that information. Obviously, the Reid technique is not something that is helpful to our community at all. Now, moving on, if we could discuss prosecutors, if you're ready to discuss that. Now, prosecutors all over the country who are in the criminal legal system, generally, folks think that the judge is in charge. Now, would you believe that prosecutors in America are actually the most powerful people in the courtroom? They control all the goings on in that courtroom. A lot of people don't realize that. They think the judge is the most powerful, but the prosecutor is the one that holds it all. Now, TL, can you explain what the prosecutor's role is in the legal system and what they do? That way we can get a better idea of what they do in their role.
This is TL signing. Esperanza, what you shared is exactly right. They have immense power and discretion in the criminal legal system. They make all of the decisions in the criminal legal system. For example, do they even want to charge a person? Do they want to drop all of the charges or some? They decide which charges to drop. Maybe you notice that sometimes when police kill someone, it feels like the charge that's levied against them is the lightest possible charge. And that's because the prosecutor decides, and the the prosecutor and police officers work together. And many people label prosecutors police. They are police officers. They're involved in the business of policing as well. They support one another. They have a mutually beneficial relationship. Also, it's important to remember that prosecutors have a very large budget when the defense team has a tiny budget. So even though they're not called police formally, they have this different name, they are in fact police. And they, in no uncertain terms, decide everything in these cases. Oh, and one interesting and sad fact is that I think 90% of prosecutors are white. I'll share those statistics with you later. So really think about that. The people making all of the charging decisions and decisions about punishment in the criminal legal system are white. They don't have lived experience as disabled or deaf people, as trans people, as other marginalized identities. And yet they still get to make all of these decisions for and about marginalized people.
This is Debbie signing. And I am really thinking about our government and the prosecutor. We need to pay attention to the election. We need to see who our local representatives are. And then we need to vote if that system needs to change. We typically do look at the judges, and that's important, but there are so many other players in the government.
Yeah, sign. That's right, Debbie. Just to let you know, your technology is moving a little slow, but I think I caught most of that. Voting. If you have voting ability, so if you're 18 or older, you should be watching the prosecutors in your local area. And that could, if you vote the right people in, that could cause a huge shift in mass incarceration in your area. So yeah, do that.
This is Esperanza signing. How much do we have left now? Okay, we have about 30 minutes left or so. Okay, thank you.
Okay, this is Debbie signing again. I wanted to make an additional comment. I'm not sure about this, but were the police that were involved in John Wilson's case that claimed to know a little bit of sign or maybe even some fingerspelling, are those police officers still around? Are they still working? Oh yeah, so it seems like they could be working with other deaf-related cases and they think what they've done is fine and that this case is an example for their others. Wow. Yikes. I get it, but that is really concerning. Well, this is Debbie again, continuing my thoughts. This discussion has been tremendously helpful, and I'm thinking that we, as a deaf community, really, we need to remember that regardless of how much open communication we want to have with the police, and regardless of whether we're innocent or whether we're guilty, frankly, it really doesn't matter. We should not be speaking directly with cops without representation. Especially because we can be nervous. There are so many things going on in our heads. We may not even be thinking correctly or signing correctly. We might not read lips. Things may not be clear. And for those of us who choose to use our voice or don't, doesn't matter. We should not be having a conversation. Writing back and forth, we should not be doing that. Signing back and forth, it doesn't matter. We should not be doing any of it. I think that we need to talk a little bit more about that later. It's kind of a different topic. These comments, again, that have been shared in the webinar, they're really focused on one case specifically. We've been looking at the police and the things that were done in this case, but this is happening all over the United States, right? Right. So as we're looking at these police officers specifically, we need to be looking at the policing system. Those on high, the machine that is making the decisions, the lawyers, the law, the policies, because it's really these lawyers, the judges, the jury, each of these people that are involved, they have someone that is over them. And we like to think that communication must be very clear there and accessible, but it seems that it's truly missing clarity. And this is going to impact the deaf and disabled communities significantly. The jury maybe, let's say, is in the courthouse and they may have an interpreter there, and they may even be thinking, oh, well, what's happening here is the same as what happened during the interrogation. But we know that potentially could be totally different. And I know most interpreters are not providing as much cultural mediation, but rather they are kind of disrupting communication to try to focus on language and get clarity and really just interpret. And that's one thing that we see often. They aren't really helping a lawyer see different perspectives. That's not what interpreters do often. They just continue moving through the case, and that's disheartening. We have to look at this whole system and have these additional discussions. These are the things I'm thinking about.
Yes, this is Esperanza. Now I'm wondering what the prosecutor, in terms of his role in John Wilson Jr.'s case, I'm wondering what the prosecutor had to do with it.
This is TL. I'm glad you asked that because I almost forgot to mention it. The prosecutor in John's case, similar to others who want to win at any cost, at anyone's expense and suffering. And so in this case, I suspect, I can't confirm it obviously, but I suspect that this prosecutor knew that John Wilson was in fact innocent, or that he at least knew that his case was very, very, very weak. Why? Why do I think that?
Remember earlier we were talking about the prosecutor making those charging decisions. They decide which charges to bring, etc. In this case, at the outset of the case, the prosecutor charged John Wilson with 6 serious crimes: murder, kidnapping. I mean, there was a whole host of charges. Now, on the second to last day of trial, the prosecutor, who was feeling that maybe his case wasn't the strongest, and instead of just being honest and saying, you know what, we made a mistake here, he goes back and says, at the end of that second to last day, I think we're going to enter a lesser charge of second-degree murder. So all of those 6 serious crimes really kind of went out the window. And the jury was able to deliberate on this lesser charge. John Wilson was convicted of second-degree murder, which was not even included in the original panoply of charges that the prosecutor offered. And that was offered because the prosecutor knew that his case was weak and that it was likely that this man wasn't the culprit. And yet he still went on and went on and went on because he wanted to win. And this happens all the time. John Wilson is not exceptional. We see where prosecutors will pursue people even when it seems like there is doubt.
This is Esperanza signing. Oh, God, that is heart-wrenching. The fact that the prosecutor knew, obviously the evidence was lacking, that John was innocent, but tried to cover his tracks, do what he could to win the case, instead of owning up to his mistakes, instead of saying, you know what, I think actually John is innocent. I made these mistakes. They accepted no responsibility. That prosecutor should have taken a hold of everything, owned up to his mistakes, and proceeded with making sure John was found innocent. They just don't own up to any of their mistakes. It's ridiculous.
This is TL. I agree. I don't have anything else to add.
This is Debbie. So the defense lawyer in this case, that individual made some mistakes too. They had some omissions. And so what happens to them? What was, and I guess what was that experience like for John Wilson in this case specifically?
This is TL. You're asking about the defense attorney and the defense attorney's bad behavior, but I think you all had some other questions planned for me around police. That's on my agenda. I can answer the defense attorney thing if you prefer right now. That's fine. Okay, yeah, let me answer the defense attorney question first. Again, I have tons of examples and I could talk about this case for years because I've been studying it so long, but I'll give you a couple.
So one thing is that the defense attorney didn't provide effective communication for his client, John Wilson, throughout the duration of his representation. And of course, those accommodations are required under federal disability rights laws, including the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Rehabilitation Act. That your lawyers are required to provide accommodations, but most lawyers are either ignorant about that law or don't provide those accommodations. During trial, for example, John Wilson said that he was writing back and forth on yellow paper. So we know what that means. You all know what those legal pads look like. They're yellow. So that's what he remembered.
So John Wilson's own lawyer used a pad and paper to communicate back and forth?
This is TL signing, and yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. Unfortunately, it's frequent that defense attorneys don't provide accommodations for their own clients. I wanted to move on to the second point, which was that during the time in which John was awaiting trial, there was no video phone. So whereas hearing people have the privilege of making calls to their attorneys, meeting with their attorneys and using their own language, John Wilson didn't have those privileges. And in a moment, I'll show you this next point, which is that the defense attorney didn't provide any witnesses at all. Meanwhile, the government, the prosecutor's side, had 14 witnesses. So imagine yourself on the jury looking at this, what you must be thinking as a jury member yourselves. Imagine that. Relatedly, the exhibits that were shown by the government and the defense were completely unequal. Where the government had, I think maybe 70 or 80 exhibits that they showed, pictures, some things that were completely irrelevant to the case, a string that was found close to the area, the list goes on and on and on. And the defense side had 4 exhibits. And those exhibits were actually just paper. Those 4 exhibits were paper, grand jury transcripts, stipulations. And this happens all the time. John Wilson, again, is not exceptional. But I want to give you all a visual of just how inequitable this looks when you put these exhibits and witnesses side by side. Give me a moment. I'm pulling something up on my computer. Do you two mind just turning yourselves off briefly? I'll be really brief. So even if we imagine that we forgot about all of these other issues in his case, communication, fingerspelling, police officers, there really wasn't a strong defense. There wasn't someone who came out on his side and said, my client is innocent and here are all the reasons why. And so when you're thinking about how a jury is looking at this, of course, the jury is human and they want to believe police officers. And remember, John Wilson at this point had stayed in prison for over 2 years. And really the full system, there's no motivation at that point to free him. In fact, it's quite the opposite. There's more reason to want to continue to incarcerate a person if you've incarcerated them already. If it was me who had made a mistake, even if I found out 2 years later, I would say, oh my gosh, I'm sorry, and I would try to repair that harm. The system was happy to just say, oh, forget about this person. They don't care about our communities. And that's why we're funneling millions and millions of people into the carceral system now, and why we have 2.3 million people in these prisons. But I just happened to find him. It really was luck. The universe collided us together. But how many other John Wilsons are there? How many other cases look just like his? And that's what happened in John's case, and it happens in many other people's cases also.
Okay, this is Debbie signing. I am really watching what you're saying. And if I understand it, John Wilson was in jail, not in prison, but in jail for 2 years. And that means he had no access to a video phone. And back then it was probably a TTY. And if it broke, he'd have to try and communicate vocally by the phone. During his jail stay, his lawyer didn't visit him. Doesn't seem like he had good preparation or support. His communication and access to the outside world just seems like it was shut off. So mentally and emotionally, he was disconnected from that world. And I can start to see how the system had already marked him. They had already decided he was guilty even before he went to court. And this went on for 2 years. Oh my.
TL signing. And again, we don't even have enough time to discuss this, but remember, our team Heard has discussed about bail or bond. So if a person can afford, and if a judge decides they're so-called deserving of bail or bond, the person gets bail or bond. It tends to be that privileged people get out and are walking around while they're waiting for trial. But what we know from research is that if a person stays in jail, the likelihood of them being convicted at trial goes through the roof, because they already look guilty to the jurors and the judge who's judging them. In the back of their mind, it says, well, the government wouldn't keep them in jail if they weren't guilty. That's already set in their minds. They must be guilty. They don't even have a chance to say, hey, I'm actually innocent. So that's the problem.
This is Esperanza signing. Thank you so much for that detailed explanation as to what the impact is on the deaf and disabled community, both for mass incarceration and wrongful conviction. The process is just horrid. So our team actually did take a training with a person named Trisha, who is an attorney. Trisha's last name is Bushnell. Trisha is an attorney for the Midwest Innocence Project. In taking her training, we learned so much. We had about wrongful conviction cases, what happens in the legal proceedings. It was so interesting. We learned about the wrongful conviction cases, and then also we discussed the concept of habeas corpus, which is really complicated. I'm still learning it, certainly no expert by any means. And then we also talked about different laws and how that helps free folks who have been wrongfully imprisoned. I know that you, TL, and Trisha were able to have a bit of a chat between the two of you a bit ago, and that has been posted to our website. I encourage folks in the audience to take a look at that because it has a lot of information about wrongful conviction. Now, I know, TL, you mentioned at the event, there's actually an event called the Actual Innocence Law. At that event, you talked about that. And how those laws may not actually apply to deaf and disabled people, that they help the hearing mainstream community. And also the barriers that deaf and disabled people face once they're in the legal system. Now, a wrongful conviction happens very often in the deaf and disabled community. I'm trying to think how to explain this. I can't remember the sign for exonerate. We haven't really come up with one. But there was a person who was exonerated. His name is Stephen Brody. Of all of the folks who have been wrongly convicted, this person has come out of it as an exoneree. His name's Stephen Brody. Can you tell me more?
Why is Stephen Brody the only deaf exoneree? The short answer is ableism. It's important to remember that even our best attorneys in the nation, the best defense attorneys, the best appellate attorneys, the best attorneys who focus on habeas corpus, for example, pretty much all of them are ignorant about disability. And so they often don't catch the red flags that disabled organizations like Heard might catch. There's some obvious red flags. For example, I'm disabled, and as soon as I saw that John Wilson was interrogated without an interpreter, it was a red flag. But there were dozens of attorneys, judges, juries, And no one seemed to have seen that in the decades before I happened upon his case. And so oppression of disabled people and systemic and structural ableism is a key issue in all of these cases, and leads to understanding why Stephen Brody is just one exoneree, the only deaf exoneree that exists to date, formally anyway. So responding to your question, though, a lot of these organizations that help develop the policy and laws to try to prevent wrongful convictions tend to focus on DNA. Whereas in many of our cases, they're not crimes necessarily of violence. They're often crimes related to miscommunications, misunderstandings. Maybe a deaf person is walking down the street, they get accosted and beat up, or maybe even killed by police because they're signing. So often the issues in the cases that Heard has found with disabled people is all about communication or lack thereof. There is no magic DNA evidence that's going to be found later. It's about communication. That's what we want to focus on. Ableism, cross-cultural misunderstandings. The proof in our cases is quite literally about abled supremacy, that the standards created to evaluate everyone's norms are based against abled, hearing, and otherwise privileged people. The other issue I've noticed is that even these intake processes for some of these network organizations that focus on actual innocence, they're so complex that disabled people can't get through them to even ask for help. The other issue is related to racism within disability, and including deaf communities, where issues of mass incarceration and issues related to multiply marginalized people within disability, mainstream disability communities is brushed off, is ignored, is thrown under the bus, and really marginalized disabled people have to be centered always. And I'm looking at my list here. And another issue is related directly to John Wilson. I can give you an example. Esperanza mentioned that training with Tricia, where Tricia told us that there's a max in many states have a maximum number of appeals a person might be able to file. John Wilson, obviously, again, English is not his first language, and he was trying to help himself during all of those years of incarceration. He was trying to tell the judge that he shouldn't be incarcerated. So he wrote a simple piece of paper to the judge, put it in an envelope, and sent it out to the judge. And when it arrived at the court, they said, oh, that's going to be counted as one of your appeals. You're down to 2. And that's where the system itself, it was a simple piece of paper, and he was trying to help himself. Why would they consider that a formal appeal? It's just not fair. So those are a couple of examples. Again, I don't want to keep going on and on, although I could. So I'll turn it back over because I know you all have more questions.
This is Esperanza. Wow, that explanation was really amazing. What we did at Heard is put out a video about wrongful imprisonment and the Black community. I encourage you all to watch that. The Black, Indigenous, disabled community is highly impacted by wrongful conviction. TL, you explained it better than I could. This has this obviously ableism, racism, and all the isms are apparent in this case. The legal system has impacts on several impacts on all of our communities. In John Wilson's case, that's one. Stephen Brody. Also other folks who've experienced wrongful convictions. I could name several people in several cases in which there was wrongful conviction, and we tried our best to free the person. And I know that it's a very frustrating situation. We need to, because the reason is because wrongful conviction comes from so many places. The law system, legal system, the family, hearing people, the powers that be. It's important that we analyze and look into ourselves as to why this is happening and how do we further perpetuate this system. Now, if time permits, I wanted to ask about what barriers that we experience in terms of wrongful conviction.
This is TL signing. I just want to touch on one thing that I think is the absolute most important thing in John Wilson's case and informs my opinion about how I know that he's innocent. Police and prosecutors both had access to one. So you all remember, I just showed you that long list of evidence and exhibits that they showed at court. You remember that? That whole list, double pages? The government itself and the police had collected some evidence 2 years before trial. And John Wilson gave the police a woman's purse. And it was that dead person's purse in his case, the person he was accused of killing. John Wilson said, hey, here, take this purse. This will help you. Myself and Freya, my daughter, who at that time was 7, helped. We were calling people all night trying to find the person who had passed away in this case using the black book in the purse. There was a black book. You all know old times, people would write down numbers so they could remember them. Now we have our phone that kind of remembers stuff for us. But at that time, people would write down, and we called that book a black book. And you have the number, name. The dead person, the girlfriend of John Wilson, had left the house, and she left her purse in the house. So John Wilson and Freya assumed she was coming back to the house. Oh, no big deal. She'll be back soon.
Clearly important evidence.
She never came back to the house. So John Wilson was like, okay, and Freya, because John Wilson's deaf, and at that time, you couldn't call, you couldn't make calls. So he asked his kid, hey, Coda, come over here and help me make these calls. And they spent hours in the morning during the time at which this person was supposedly killed, calling people. Hey, have you seen this person? Their sign name starts with an E. Have you seen? He had a strong alibi. This is during the hours at which he's supposed to be killing this person. And look, on that evidence list, the purse is nowhere to be found on the evidence list. It was never entered at trial. Why would they not introduce that at trial? John Wilson himself said, oh, I just didn't even think it was important. I happened to ask him that maybe 5 years ago. I said, where is that purse? And I said, I noticed you talked about a purse. He said, oh, I gave that purse to the police. And the police were on the stand, and they swore under oath, and they never once mentioned a purse. Not once, never mentioned a purse. The prosecutor, in his framing, his opening statements and closing statements, said the reason why we suspect John Wilson is guilty is because he was behaving suspiciously. And because he was calling people at strange hours of the morning that he had never called before. And well, yeah, of course. He was trying to figure out where the dead person was. Where is his girlfriend? He's calling, and with the support of his kid, and there was another person in the home at the same time, and they never mentioned that. And that is how I know fully that the police and the prosecutors knew that John Wilson was an innocent man, and they targeted him and they put him in prison, and they hid that evidence. And that would have been proof to liberate him. I'm going to shut up now. Obviously, I could talk about this forever, but I know that time is short. So I will now answer your question, and I'll make this brief. You just asked me, and I'm going to say it's best not to chat with the police. Doesn't matter if you're guilty or innocent. Again, John Wilson was innocent, and it's innocent people who are more tending to try to help and chat with the police. And that's the reason why you do it. You have nothing to hide. And really, it should be the opposite. All of us need to assert our right to silence. That is all. Period, point blank. There is no other way other than emphasizing this week, we are trying to abolish the carceral system and the policing system. We want to take that money back. We want to defund the police and invest in our communities who know better how to serve and protect our communities and to reduce harm than the police who continue to perpetuate more violence in our marginalized communities. And that is why we're hosting this week, to emphasize that for deaf and disabled people who often don't realize the disproportionate impact that disabled folks are experiencing in the carceral system. And that is my preaching for the night, and I'm done.
This is Debbie signing, and I really just need to say, with the bottom line here is that when you see a police officer, do not interact. It doesn't matter if you're innocent or if you're guilty. It doesn't matter. Make sure that you have a lawyer first. Just like the comments about the purse in John Wilson's case, he wanted to help. He gave the purse to the authority, but that did not end well. And we should all be very much more aware. Go ahead and call the lawyer and an advocate so that you can avoid perhaps being detained. Again, this is really just not a single case and a single situation and a single person. It's the whole system that needs to be addressed. In my heart, I just keep seeing all of these small things that have this cumulative and huge impact. But please do not talk with the police.
This is Esperanza signing. Absolutely right. If we think that it's an individual cop issue, maybe the cop itself is just the problem. That's not true. And the same applies to a person who's convicted. This person is not just affected, it's their family, it's their friends, it's everyone who they interact with every single day. Which is why I think, again, we need to abolish the entire system. This is a continual system of violence and harm, and it needs to stop. We need to support each other as a community, support people who are incarcerated, especially those who are wrongfully convicted. And I want to honor and recognize folks who are here tonight who have been in prison before. They're formerly incarcerated with no communication, no accessibility. And I'm honored that we're being trusted to help provide access and to help understand why wrongful convictions actually happen. This takes so much time to learn. This is not a one and done kind of workshop. It is a lifetime of learning that we need to do to understand why and how this happens and how we can abolish it. So I know we're about to run out of time, and so I do want to wrap up and close. I know that we can continue this conversation forever about wrongful convictions and the impact of that on deaf and disabled people. Not only that, but their families, their community, their friends. And the big problem is the system, the powers that be. I would encourage those in the audience to put out on social media if you find a video from Heard that you like. Please use the hashtag deaf wrongful convictions or the hashtag
deaf in prison.
This is Debbie signing, and I want to add the hashtag John Wilson Lives so that we all may continue to honor him and his family and pass on his story. His story is really the reason that Heard was established.
This is Esperanza. Yes, thank you, Debbie, for adding that hashtag. We cannot forget John Wilson. The impact that man had is so powerful. And to the audience, we will have one last panel event for the week commemorating John Wilson Jr. And we'll specifically talk about mass incarceration. That'll be tomorrow. That's with Heard Advocates at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I encourage you all to join us for this last, final, and great event in order to honor John Wilson's life, because the impact is not just on him, it's on all of us.
This is Debbie signing. The access to that is not open. People must register first. They can't simply just access it. So please make sure they register.
This is Esperanza. Yes, you do need to register. I think tech support maybe could post a link in the chat.
This is TL. It's bit.ly/John Wilson Lives. And it's also in the chat.
Yes, thank you. This is Esperanza. Thank you both. Thank you, TL, for that hashtag. So we're looking forward to seeing you tomorrow. We hope that you can join us. If not, we will record these for your consumption later if you'd like to watch. Again, I want to thank everyone, the Heard Advocates, everyone for helping us discuss this difficult event and for, bearing your souls. So thank you so much. Please take care of yourself. And I want to thank Heard Tech Support, the interpreters, and the captionists. And finally, I want to thank the audience for being such willing participants, for going on the journey with us to open your eyes and your heart. Thank you so much.